Personnel Committee to study the role and responsibilities of an executive director. Also appointed Mr. Spoonhour, capacity for the health committee as chair, and just wanted to share that what they want again. And Mr. Spoonhour, if there are any needs that your committee have, be sure to let me know. May share some of those things you choose.
Thank you, Chair. We met this week. Thank everybody on the committee for the short notice moving the meeting up. We had to scramble, so we had a really good, productive meeting. We've got a good plan outlined. I'd say from a need perspective, we are requesting support from the HR roundtable. So if you can go back to your localities and support that effort, it's going to be important, especially with the timeline is pretty tight for the charge that was given. We're going to work aggressively towards that. Staff is going to be working on multiple options for us to review. We're going to review that with the Finance Committee and the HR Committee, and then be able to come back with that sort of that air cover for helping us with some HR support would be very appreciated. And thanks to the localities that have reached out to offer support. We feel the love.
Thank you for that. And reaching here to support you and your committee's important work. And also, you know, the president chair believes in flexibility. So if something were to, and you would think that you need additional time, I don't see anything wrong with it. Just not letting us know.
Thank you.
Okay, this time then we go to B, committee reports. First committee report for the CVTA Finance Committee update.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning, everyone. I hope everyone is staying cool and hydrated in summer heat from Central Virginia. In our upcoming Finance Committee meetings, the committee will be continuing our discussions on the regional project financing and the authority's investment policy, among other things. Today, I'd like to turn it over to Ms. Heater to present the committee's report on the memorandum of agreement between the CVTA and our localities. Ms. Heater.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Just wanted to give an update. Thanks to the jurisdictions who have already scheduled the memorandum of agreement for local decision. As you know, those were approved by the authority for circulation to the jurisdictions, and many of the local boards and councils have already reviewed and taken action. So we appreciate that. And for those of you that have scheduled it, we also are keeping track of that. And so this will serve as my friendly reminder that if you don't know what I'm talking about, we will get with your TAC number to make sure that it's forwarding through to be scheduled on your maybe August meeting agenda at this point. But we do appreciate you putting this on your summer schedules. I know most of you try to winnow those down. I think in consultation with Mr. Gregory, we'll be bringing back the whole suite of the 9 local government MOUs to this authority at the September meeting to be able to authorize execution. So we're very excited about hitting yet another milestone in the course of the CVTA formation.
Thank you, Ms. Heater. Mr. Chairman, that concludes my report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Any questions, anyone on that report? If not, then we go now to B6, the CVTA Technical Advisory Committee update. Mr. Todd.
Morning. Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the last CVTA TAC meeting was this past Monday, July 12th. We covered two primary items that have been being worked on at the subcommittee level. The first, the regional prioritization process. That subcommittee met last on within the last month on June 25th. And then again, a smaller group met on July 9th to specifically cover bridges and how to integrate bridges into the prioritization process. Result of those discussions is looking like we're going to now recommend 5 different categories as opposed to originally 4 that I presented at the last meeting. So as a refresher, we'll have highways, bike ped, transit, multimodal, and bridges as separate categories of regional projects. The subcommittee is continuing to work on refining the measures and how to integrate them. And then we have a meeting this afternoon to further refine and discuss that. We're going to begin discussing the application limits and whether there should be a cap, what that cap should look like between the larger jurisdictions and smaller jurisdictions, much like in the smart scale process. And with consideration of how to fully consider the needs of all localities at the regional level, both large and small. So the full expectation is that the subcommittee will wrap up their work, have that ready to come to the CVTA TAC at the August 9th meeting, continue to refine. As a reminder, there will not be a full authority meeting in the month of August, so that will allow 2 TAC meetings prior to the next full authority meeting. So we have opportunities to fully vet that through the full TAC and distribute the draft recommendations to the full authority in advance of the September meeting. At the September meeting, we anticipate having a presentation in detail of all of the recommended prioritization measures and have it for your consideration at that meeting. The second item that has been worked on at the subcommittee level and they come to the TAC on Monday for recommendation to the full authority is the transit governance report. I'll be turning this over to Chet to introduce, and we have the AECOM consultant team ready to give us a brief overview of that study.
Thank you, Mr. Ure. AECOM, are you on the line with us?
Yes, we are.
I'm going to turn this over to Stephanie Yankson, who is the project manager for the AECOM project team that's been developing the transit service governance report. Stephanie, if you're available, share your screen or let me know if you need help from the center.
Yes. Is this correct? Can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Stephanie Yankson. I'm the technical lead for this study for the transit governance report from AECOM. Also with me is Peter Voorhees, who is the program director for the GRTC contract. Peter?
Hi, good morning, everyone. I don't need to say a lot this morning. It's been really a pleasure to be able to work with the CVTA on this study. And a lot of the work has been performed by Stephanie. I'll let her speak to it.
All right. So this morning, we're just going to give you a brief overview of the final recommendations for the transit governance study. What we are going to look at first is just first review the study purpose and objectives, looking at some study questions that we wanted to answer by the end of this study. We'll briefly go over the approach, the key governance issues we identified, and our study findings. I believe we have about 10 minutes or 15 minutes for this. So just keep in mind that this is a very high level summary of our final recommendations, and the draft final report is available for in-depth review. So this study began in February. We had our first kickoff in towards the end of February, and we've gone through several phases. It first included starting with a strategic assessment of GRTC, looking at, we did some stakeholder interviews as well. We spoke with over 40 individuals from the different jurisdictions in the CVTA members, including some members of the state legislature as well. We looked at a review of transportation districts and did case studies of transit agencies or regions throughout the country that had similar operational characteristics as GRTC. We synthesized all this information and pulled out certain key governance issues from the case, from the stakeholder interviews. We addressed them by identifying strategies and answered the study questions. And finally today, July 16th, is the presentation of our main recommendations. Many of you already know that this study really came about because of the new legislation that created a CVTA. The CVTA, as part of the legislation, there was a tax that has a transit component. And this transit component was 15% that contributes to transit services throughout the region. So the objective really of this study was to first evaluate the governance structure of GRTC, reviewing the existing mechanisms to see if accountability was sufficient. We also looked at the establishment of a transportation district in the Richmond region. And finally was to provide options for GRTC or the establishment of a transportation district. So we sought to answer certain questions that were pressing. First, it was, should the GRTC board be revamped to include elected officials? Now, this really came about because of, there was interest in involving elected officials when it came to decisions related to the expenditure of that 15% transit funding. Next, we wanted to find out if the existing mechanisms ensure accountability in a sufficient manner. Accountability, again, of that 15% transit component funding. Third, we wanted to find out if the GRTC board, as it was, needed to be revamped to include more members from the CVTA jurisdictions. At present, we have representation from two jurisdictions. That's the city of Richmond and Chesterfield County on the board. And then there was also the question about the rural jurisdictions, the smaller jurisdictions, about potential service, new service or additional service, and how that could be taken into consideration when looking at the contribution of that 15% funding. And finally, there was also the question of forming a transportation district. The chart you're looking at here it shows us an overview of the steps that we went through, our project approach, which I already discussed previously. So these were the key 5 steps in going through this project. Now, after the extensive stakeholder interview process, where we spoke to more than 40 individuals, we came up with 3 key issues that seemed to be at the top of the stakeholders' priority list. So the first was with decision-making and accountability for that transit funding. And what specifically was the role of elected officials in that, in decision-making when it came to expenditure of that funds. Second was about board representation for GRTC. As I mentioned before, currently GRTC board has representation from the city and Chesterfield County. So there was a question of Henrico County representation. Then there was also some interest shown by the smaller jurisdictions or the more suburban or rural areas in having representation on the board as well. Another issue that arose was about decision-making equity. There was concern that historical financial investments made into the system may not be taken into consideration in the correct manner when considering the board representation or voting power. Finally, we looked at what the implications of the governance structure, the GRTC governance structure were for any potential changes that would be implemented. So currently the GRTC is structured as a public service corporation, company, sorry, and it has shareholders, with the two shareholders being the city and Chesterfield County. So we wanted to understand what those implications that structure would have on adding or changing the board structure in any way. So now I'm going to go straight into our final recommendations and findings. So concerning the decision-making and accountability for the 15% CVTA funding, we found that the current mechanisms in place are sufficient in ensuring accountability. First, there's this accountability provided by the elected officials on the CVTA board. The question about accountability really was concerning the fact that the current board was made up of citizen members. And so there was this need or interest in having, there was an interest in having elected officials on the current board. But we see that by the CVTA board itself having the presence of elected officials, there was oversight for that funding. There's also oversight and funding provided through the CVTA itself. There's the finance committee that provides, that needs to approve the plans or projects that are going to be funded by GRTC using that CVTA funding. So through the finance committee, there's again another layer of oversight. There's also the regional public transportation plan to be developed by GRTC. And this plan would be collaborative with the regional partners. So through that plan, there's also a means for the regional partners to engage and have their needs met through that plan and selection of projects. There was also accountability and oversight through the TAC committee, the CVTA Technical Advisory Committee, that also reviews the plans and the project list. So regarding this, we found that the existing mechanisms are sufficient to ensure accountability for that 15% transit funds. We also found that the elected officials have enough, the current mechanisms allow elected officials to participate in decisions regarding the expenditure of that funding. Next, we looked at board representation, GRTC board representation. Now this issue was divided into two main parts. The first part, we looked at representation of Henrico County on the board, and the second was about the smaller jurisdictions. So with regard to Henrico County, we recommend that the current board, the city of Richmond and Chesterfield County, consider including Henrico County in their current board structure. With regard to the board composition itself and voting power, further dialogue is needed in order to determine the exact numbers of board representatives from each jurisdiction. In order to move to this step, there's an unresolved issue of looking at historical investments from the city's perspective in GRTC. So we recommend that the four entities, that is GRTC, City of Richmond, Chesterfield County, and Henrico County, open dialogue to continue this discussion to resolve those issues. And then we've laid out the steps necessary to incorporate Henrico County into the on the GRTC board in the final report. In terms of board composition, looking at the numbers and the voting power, something criteria that could be considered would include the revenue miles, that is amount of service that is provided in each jurisdiction, looking at it by mode for both fixed route and the paratransit services. Also looking at the funding available for supporting those services and the associated paratransit service, both the ones required by law and the enhanced paratransit service. Secondly, under this bullet of GRTC board representation is the question of how should members from the rural or suburban CVTA member areas be included in the GRTC board. We saw that this became an issue really because there were certain concerns from those jurisdictions. First, there was a concern of contributing to that 15% funding without receiving either enough or any service at all. Then there's also a concern that they were potentially subsidizing transit in areas that currently receive CVTA funding. And this was because of the clause in the legislation that allowed the current funders to reduce their contributions to up to 50% of the pre-CVTA levels. And then finally, there was a certain level of dissatisfaction for not having the direct input on the board because of the issues mentioned before. Now, in looking at this, we identified and saw that the 15% contributions in about the concern of contributing without receiving any service would be addressed because this funding is placed in a separate account, a separate bucket to GRTC. So in that sense, that funding is reserved for regional purposes. And the regional public transportation plan that GRTC is working on is designed to lay out what regional services will be used for that 15%. Again, this is a collaborative approach that the elected officials or even members from the TPO have input in developing this plan. Next, about the concern of subsidizing transit. Again, because the funding is going to be used for regional services, that concern can be alleviated. Part of the plans I know GRTC is working on is to review what viable markets there are in their region outside of their existing areas of service, and to see what the appropriate level of service needed and the appropriate amount of cost for those services would be. And so once that is addressed, questions about new service can be answered, and how much it would cost to actually provide those services can also be addressed. And then finally, with regard to board membership, it is our recommendation that at the moment, there can be an opt-in clause included in the CVTA's, in the GRTC governance documents that allows for future additions to the board. Now, this would consider areas looking at their minimum size and viability for service itself, their density and the need of service in that localities. Then there should also be a clause for a minimum commitment when it comes to financial responsibility to ensure that those services can be provided in the long term. So this is a summary of the final recommendation for this. So at present, board representation for CVTA member jurisdictions, they cannot solely be based on their existing contributions. Rather, in considering future service, we can look at the service need viability and financial commitment, and using that to create an opt-in clause for potential additions in the future. Finally, we looked at what implications of the current structure on any changes in the board representation. So like I mentioned before, there's this 50-50 ownership between the city and Chesterfield County. And what would changes to the board, the GRTC board, have to that? So for this, we recommend that the current owners should consider these two options. First, either changing the shareholder structure, that is doing away with it completely, and only using the board as the main governance entity. And then second, if doing away with the shareholder structure is not attractive, another option would be to directly equate board membership with a number of shares. So currently it's not an issue because it's a 50-50 representation and 50-50 ownership. But should Henrico County be added, then depending on what that board composition should be, we recommend that we equate that with the quantity of shares so that there's no confusion in that for that issue, sorry. Finally, we looked at the evaluation of a transportation district. With this, we looked at what the definition of the transportation district, the purpose, examples of other transportation districts in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And what we came to understand was trying to determine whether there was the marginal benefit in establishing a new transportation district in the region would outweigh the potential challenges for implementing that. And what we found was that there's no clear evidence at present to show that when compared with the strategies that we've recommended, the marginal benefit would outweigh the potential challenges. So at this moment, we recommend that the new transportation district not be formed, rather as the new entities being CVTA establishes itself and some of the plans are implemented, after a period of review to see how well these governance issues we've identified have been solved, then if the concerns are still present, we can look at the establishment of a transportation district. So this concludes just a brief high-level overview of the main recommendations for this study, and we can take any questions that you may have now.
Madam Chair, would like to refer to Tim.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And thank you to Chad and his team for really spearheading this and all the technical staff from all the different counties and cities for the hard work they put into putting this together. I know it was a very short time frame, and I believe that the information that came out of it was solid. Next steps for GRTC would be, assuming that this moves forward as it's written, is to advance a microtransit study. One of what we're hearing and what I've heard for the past months and what has been expressed here is that there is a desire to see that regional connectivity in transit and how does it pull together. Assuming that it is approved on Tuesday, we will bring an action to the GRTC board to advance that microtransit study to look at the needs of transit throughout the region, what those needs are, what the resources are, and how we might pilot certain ways to connect different communities throughout the region to the regional transit network. And we're also looking at preserving a certain amount of the federal stimulus money, the federal relief money, to pilot some of those so that we can continue to advance in a regional nature. I know that there are also conversations happening internally with the different stakeholders and shareholders on how to bring Henrico on board and how also to make it scalable or replicatable, that's the correct word, so that others in the region, when it is time and appropriate, who wish to become a member of the board will also have a clear avenue to do so. And those are the next steps for GRTC at this time. As the micro mobility or the micro transit study advances, it will be included as part of our FY23 regional public transit plan. That would come, of course, to this board and to all of the staff and members of the plan RVA to be able to have input and review in that process.
Okay, any questions, presentation, or statement by Ms. Tim? One,
Mr. Chairman,
yes.
as I sit and listen to this, and I thank you, Ms. Sam, and I'm thankful for the survey that was done. I can tell you that I don't know how complicated it would be. I can tell you in 1959, a bus would leave Gloucester. It would come up Route 33 on Wednesdays and Saturdays, and it would stop, and residents could go to Richmond, downtown Richmond, to the Trailways bus station. On Tuesdays and Fridays, it would leave Gloucester until Route 60 and go to Richmond. So it has always been a need for connectivity between the rural area and the city, even though downtown looks totally different than it did in 1959. However, it is an urgency, as I explained to when we took the survey. It is a necessity, especially that those in the rural areas be able to connect, whether it is going from the area to Richmond or coming down. We have the park and go and park and rides, but we have to connect, especially get our older adults to the city and surrounding areas, especially looking at workforce and how great would it be to be able to get rural citizens in areas now that are much needed for workforce. And so it is a study that I hope that progresses with purpose. And so, Mr. Chairman, those are my comments, and thank you for the opportunity.
Thank you for those comments.
I am excited for the study. I do believe that there is the need to have that connectivity, and it's not necessarily with our standard 40-foot bus. I'm not sure. Some people were surprised to learn that the Vanpool program is actually part of GRTC. And so when we look at the tools to have that regional connectivity, we'll be looking at maybe new forms of micro transit, things that are on demand, like Uber Lyft model. We'll look at Vanpool. We don't always want to have it be a bus because there aren't all areas of the region that need a bus, but we do have need for connectivity. So that is the purpose of this micro transit study, to look at various forms of mobility connectivity throughout the region and how we connect to that regional network. I appreciate your comments very much, and I look forward to this next year of identifying these things.
Thank you. Other questions or comments? This is an item that,
No.
okay, this is an item of action that's requested,
Mr.
recommendation.
Chairman,
Mr. Peterson.
Get a little frustrated in the sense that we had conversations, and I'm not too sure the final report has responded to those in any way other than this micro. And with that in mind, the micro transit study is indicated to identify things. But is there a time frame that we're talking about? But we're going to be contributing quite a few funds to GRTC for Hanover County. For how many years before we ever see any results from our investments? So this might tell me a little bit about the study, what the time frame is, and what kind of time frame are we looking at for activating some of these things that you're trying to identify.
Certainly. So part of this is that it's going to be a fluid and iterative process to get there. In the FY22 Regional Public Transportation Plan that was approved by this board, we are taking the FY21 money to use for FY22, and we're going to preserve the FY22 funds for FY23. The FY22 funds, we expect that a certain amount of those funds, probably somewhere around the realm of 20 or 21 million, will be used for preservation of existing and established service. And the incremental difference would be used for the expansion of our service to include microtransit, fortification of existing service, expansion of existing service, and how it connects. The forecast is that that amount of incremental difference could be somewhere between $8 to $12 million, depending on the economy. And that's the amount of money that we would be looking to invest in FY23 for expansion. Now, the priorities of where that money goes, how it's expanded for pilots, we hope to be able to establish that this year.
If I could follow a question on that, maybe it's just I'm done as institute on this as others, but define microtransit.
I think it's a relatively new term. I'm not sure how broad it is, and so I'm using it very loosely. I'm talking about microtransit as the connectivity that doesn't necessarily involve a 40-foot bus. I believe that the work was done by staff across the region to look at how we could use CVTA money to expand frequencies and service associated with 40-foot buses on our existing network. We have a good sense of what that is. What we don't have is we don't have a good sense about how to use smaller buses, use sedans, use on-demand service, use maybe a pass-through Uber Lyft service, how we look at senior ride service, how we look at van pool service, how we look at other needs throughout the region, connect to that region, or maybe be independent. And so the microtransit study will be looking at non-40-foot bus service and how it connects to that regional public system. And if we find there are things that don't connect, what other resources can we leverage to try and help put those into service as well? Does that explain it? And it's a very broad, loose term.
Somewhat.
And it's open to, it's going to be very open as we have a very hopefully transparent and open process with each of the jurisdictions, your staff, yourself, that as we define where your pockets of need are for populations that might have more senior riders or more impoverished riders or people who are workforce riders, where your jobs are, how they connect to more urban environments. We'll look and see what kind of mobility services best suit that market and that need. So it could be very, very customized to the needs of each jurisdiction, how it comes in. That's what I'm hoping we'll find over the next year, because I don't think we have a good handle on what those needs and resources are.
If I just as an example, and I know other jurisdictions, Hanover County, we have basically two different transportation options right now that are transit options. And one of them is county with the support of grants from the Hanover Dash program, which serves disabled and elderly citizens throughout our county. The grocery stores, medical. We also have a volunteer group, which is seen with Silver Rise, and Charlie Rasmus, I think, knows on that. But that's all, that's totally a private charity. Is the intent of GRTC to partner with these groups on the outlying jurisdictions and to provide additional support to them?
That is, I have a position on the street right now for a new position at GRTC, which is going to be the Director of Organizational Advancement, who will specifically spearhead a lot of these conversations with their communities, with the needs, with nonprofit sector, with the business sector, to leverage other resources to pull this together. So it absolutely is my intention that we assist with these communications if we have the ability. I don't know if we become a clearinghouse board or not with this body, if there's another way, but we definitely want to see those connections advance, and whatever we do to support it, that's my goal.
Thank you,
Mr. Chairman,
Yes.
so Julie, just to make sure that I understand the conversation we just had with Mr. Pearson, you're going to be doing some type of requirements definition in those counties to the development of this specialized transportation plan.
sure I followed that.
So-
I'm sorry.
You're gonna be coming to the community, and you're gonna be meeting with stakeholders, i.e. people like myself and other members of the community, to understand what our requirements are for transportation,
Yes,
whether it's for elderly, disabled, or whether it's, like Ms. Page said, helping people get to Richmond. You're gonna do that, and you're gonna document that, and then you're gonna be making recommendations to us.
yes, sir.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I just want to say for the record, we welcome the multiple ways for other localities to get to the city of Richmond. I really do appreciate the work of GRTC, AECom on this governance report, and I believe this body's responsibility is to accept the report. So I move to accept.
Okay, and for your edification, Ms. Fox, would you just read?
Yes, sir, I'd be happy to. So the TAC did take action to recommend that the CVTA accept the report as complete, fulfilling the requirements of the Code of Virginia, and to transmit the accepted report to the Governor and General Assembly upon acceptance. Yes.
Okay, well, this time the clerk will roll call vote on this, okay?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I take the roll, I would like to acknowledge that Senator McCallum has joined us, as well as Mr. Koda is joining us on the DSC this morning. Town of Ashland, Mr. McGraw.
Aye.
Charleston County, Mr. Koda.
Aye.
Chesterfield County, Vice Chair Carroll.
Aye.
Richmond County, Mr. Schoonhour.
Aye.
Kimberly County, Mr. Peterson.
Aye.
And Franklin County, Chair Thornton.
Aye.
Newton County, Ms. Page.
Aye.
Calhoun County, Mr. Williams.
All right,
City of Richmond, Mayor Stoney.
Aye.
And Senator McCollum.
Aye.
Thank you. That concludes the roll call and the motion passed.
Okay, Chair would like to say the following about, the report that was given by, Mr. Buell on, prioritization. As you know, one of our concerns has been also making sure we have equity, and particularly thinking about the smaller localities. And so you also heard us suggest very strongly that we want to be as flexible as we can. And the chair would also like to suggest that probably the smaller localities should get together and kind of start drawing up now a list of things that they would like to see as their priorities. I think that'd be very, very efficacious. So please give that some thought. Okay, now we go to number 7, CVTA nominating committee report. Ms. Page.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for the opportunity. A report for the nominating committee that consists of Mr. Peterson, Mr. John Hodges, and Mr. David Williams, and myself met several times. I have the dates before me, and I apologize for that. And our nominations are as follows. For the CVTA chair, we nominate Frank Thornton. For vice chair, we nominate Kevin Carroll. For the positions on the finance committee, we nominate Carlos Brown, and also we nominate Cordova Peterson. And so we realize that nominations can come from the floor, but it is the recommendation of this nominating committee to accept the nominations as presented. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Ms. Page.
Second.
At this time, I request CBTA Administrator Mr. Chet Parsons to discuss the nominating committee report and conduct the election of officers and appointees to the finance committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, members of the board, the nominating committee's nominees and recommended appointees are as follows. Mr. Frank Thornton to serve as chair, Mr. Kevin Carroll to serve as vice chair, Mr. Cordova Peterson to serve on the finance committee, and Mr. Carlos Brown to serve on the finance committee. In accordance with CVTA bylaws, additional nominations to these positions may be made by any CVTA member at this time. Are there any additional nominations? Members of the board, I defer to Ms. Page to move the nominees for election to chair and vice chair of the CVTA.
Mr. Chair, I move that the nominations made by the nominating committee be accepted or voted on in this committee full body.
Ms. Page has moved to elect Mr. Frank Thornton, Mr. Kevin Carroll as CVTA chair and CVTA vice chair respectively for fiscal year 2022. Ms. Mueller, would you please conduct a roll call vote?
I'm Mr. McGraw.
Aye.
Charles City County, Mr. Fota.
Aye.
Jacksonville County, Vice Chair Carroll.
Aye.
Richmond County, Mr. Stewart.
Aye.
Hanover County, Mr. Peterson.
Aye.
And Wrightville County, Chair Thornton.
Aye.
Houston County, Ms. Page.
Aye.
Powhatan County, Mr. Williams.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Mayor Stoney.
Aye.
And Senator McClellan. Aye. Thank you. That's the roll call. The motion passed.
Mr. Chair, I move to appoint Mr. Cadova Peterson and Mr. Carlos Brown to CBTA Finance Committee for this year 2022.
Ms. Page has moved to appoint Mr. Kevin Peterson and Mr. Carlos Brown to the CVTA Finance Committee for fiscal year 2022. Ms. Mueller, would you please conduct a roll call vote on that motion?
Thank you. Town of Ashland, Mr. McGraw.
Aye.
Charles City County, Mr. Fota. Hanover County, Mr. Peterson.
Aye.
And Wrightville County, Chair Thornton.
Aye.
Houston County, Ms. Page.
Aye.
Powhatan County, Mr. Williams.
Aye.
City of Richmond, Mayor Stoney.
Aye.
Senator McClellan. Aye. Thank you. Motion passed.
Congratulations, Mr. Chairman. This concludes the election and appointment of officers. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Parsons, members of the board. I congratulate those elected and appointed. And, I've been using analogies all the time, so we want to continue to look out and make sure that the next year will be even more successful. I've been making a few comments at the end about something similar to that. Okay, at this time, C9, Ms. Heater.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the last page of your packet that includes the proposed schedule for meetings for the upcoming year. The CVTA bylaws require that at the annual meeting, the members of the authority will approve the schedule of meetings for the year. So we put together a proposed schedule not only for the authority, but for the tax and the finance committee so that their work can flow into those meetings. The action requested by the authority is simply to act on the proposed schedule for the authority meetings that are listed there. You will note that this does include a proposed cancellation of the August meeting due to summer schedules, and also to make some changes to the November and December meetings to avoid holidays and what we perceive to be a likely conflict around that time of year, as well as next summer in the end of May and early June. So happy to answer any questions. We put this before you for your action and approval today. And I would note that on the chair's request, we have identified a location for the next two meetings in September and October at the Central Virginia Waste Management Authority's location on Laverne Avenue at the Interstate Center. So we'll make sure that you have information about the location, but just to be sure that you know well in advance where the meetings will be located and everything.
Any questions?
Yeah. I assume the meetings will continue at the same time.
Yes, that is the recommendation.
And Ms. Heater is, will the virtual accessibility be a permanent option?
Great question. At the next meeting, I believe that the authority will have before them a policy that will consist of recommendations for how members may, under the provisions of the state, participate in meetings virtually. As you know, we are in a bit of a transition period with the governor's declaration of emergency expiring at the end of June. However, members who are participating virtually right now are doing so under the city's action. And so that is in effect until the end of December, if I'm not mistaken. But in the meantime, in order to comply with the new Freedom of Information Act requirements, the council now requires that each public body adopt its own procedures for virtual participation. And we'll be bringing you a recommended policy on that front at your September meeting.
And that will also include the public's participation as well?
Yes, sir. So that's a bit of a different piece. And so what Plan RBA is doing with the public bodies that it supports is also putting together a revised set of guidelines for how the public may participate in public meetings that we support. The YouTube streaming will continue. And so we believe that that has been an enhancement to the public participation process during this time, coming out an unintentional benefit of the last 14 months. And so we will continue that, but we will be updating the guidelines for how the members of the public can participate, particularly through that public comment period, to make that more accessible than it perhaps has been in the last few months.
Other questions to Ms. Heater?
Just a comment, it is very likely that in the budget adopted by the special session, there will be more guidance.
We look forward to that. Thank you very much.
Chairman, entertain a motion.
Motion to approve.
And a second.
Second.
Motion made, properly second. All those in favor vote aye.
Aye.
Those opposed? All right. Ladies and gentlemen, we now come to that part of the agenda, just before adjournment. Any comments that any of you may have?
Mr. Chair, if you would, so most of you know, this is brand new for me, so unlike some of you, I still am a high-eyed optimist about a lot of things, even transportation-wise. You know, when I lived in Henrico County, right off Springfield, my annual, I put about 5,000 miles on my car. When I moved to Goochland, I put 15,000 miles on my car. Most of my neighbors in my district are not on the higher income scale. So these are a lot of disenfranchised folks. And the gas tax hits them really hard. Now, I know we heard last month that it didn't affect the price of gas. I'm gonna dive into that a little bit more just because I'm not really good at math, but so there does come, I think, from some of the rural localities, and I'll only speak for myself, some skepticism when we're talking about GRTC, where we don't have services, where we don't have this. But Goochland County hired transportation managers this year. We actually, after leaving one of these meetings, fought for that. And he's here with us today, and we had a meeting with him. And you know, it was one of those beautiful times where somebody that's been actually doing this a long time can give you a perspective that you didn't have. And you know, I was kind of lamenting, it was closed session, so I could be more less politically correct. And I was talking about how unfortunate it is that, you know, we're participating in something we can't utilize. And Mr. Campbell said to me, he says, well, and he has come from VDOT. He said, you know, he said, I would challenge you to look at it a different way. He said, because of this, we now have potential access to services that we didn't have. And within 30 seconds, that kind of changed my whole frame of reference. And it's not going to be easy, but I'm really excited about the micro mobility study. You know, Goochland Cares in our area does similar services that Mr. Peterson said. And I was ignorant to the fact that there were such transportation needs for some of our elderly, and they can't get to their doctor's appointments. They can't do these things. So I'm not sure when the time frame is going to be, but you know, I'm going to hold on to that, you know, rookie pie optimism for just a bit longer. So I'm excited about this. So thank you, Mr. Campbell.
Other comments from other members?
Mr. Chair, this is not only a transportation comment, but also an invitation. And this invitation, you will experience both if you accept the invitation. So starting July the 19th at 1:45 on Colonial Downs in New Kent County, off of beautiful I-64 East, we'll start their racing season, 21 days of live horse racing. And I invite each and every one of you to please attend. you will find out that I-64 East is no longer just weekend and seasonal traffic issues. And so, please, ma'am, and please, sir, we welcome you to beautiful New Kent County and experience the racing season. And on August the 31st is Virginia Derby Day, and we will have Skybox, and I will welcome any of you that come up as my guests at that box. So I am excited about the possibility of things that will happen through CVTA, not only in beautiful New Kent County, but in all of the localities that are here. And I think that teamwork does make dream work. And so it is now, for me, CVTA has become a ray of hope for those things that seem so far, far away. So I thank you, sir, for the opportunity to speak. And also I thank you for your continued leadership of this CVTA.
Mr. Chairman, a follow-up question from this page.
Yes, sir.
Does this invitation include yes money as well as a place in Scott Booth?
We just want you to come, sir. I tell you,
I do too.
every time you drive
just
in New
need a
Kent,
little
you will
help.
be supporting the gas. You will be supporting the gas tax, which will also support this authority.
I continue to be a donor, right?
Maybe we can get a bus service.
Mr. Williams, maybe we can carpool, good ride share.
Yeah, figure transportation.
Exactly.
Other comments?
Yeah.
Vice Chair.
I just want to say thank you to the members of this body for entrusting me in the vice chair position again for another year. I have really enjoyed the opportunity not just to serve on this board, but also to get to know each and every one of you over the past year. And it's been challenging for us because of COVID, meeting remotely, which I think slows down that process of building relationships because we don't have the other opportunities to get to know each other on a more personal level, which I think building those friendships and relationships, getting to know each other is how we can work, I think, better together. And it's really been an honor for me. Sometimes I have to pinch myself to believe that I actually get to do this. And it's the truth. You know, all of us have, I believe, be servants' hearts, and that we want to try and do what's best for our communities individually and certainly collectively by serving on a number of different communities that we do to build what we hope to be a better future for our communities and for our children. And so it really is an honor for me. And I just want to say thank you again for trusting me in the vice chair's position. And I look forward to the tremendous and wonderful things that we're all going to accomplish together. And 10 or 15 years down the road, people look at what we did and go, wow, that's really good. And so thank you.
And as a coda to this, let me say also that you got to know when I toot our horn. You may not want to toot your horn in public, but at least learn how to do it in private. And that is that it has nothing to do with who's sitting here or where you're sitting, but it really has to do with the future. The future is that what we're putting together is a region with a transportation system that is a place where people want to come. People won't know your names, won't know my name. At least they will say, I want to go. What's that district? I think District 15. I want to go there because what you are doing today. I want to thank you. Sometimes things are far out. We have had questions about it. There's no doubt about it. We're going in the right direction because we all are possibility people. So I thank you for what you do, and what you're going to do. It is going to be bumpy sometimes, but we're going to get there. So here again, as we conclude, thank you earnestly and honestly for just coming and finding out there was not a creature 2 years ago called CVTA. There should have been one. There was not. But we have one today. And because of our predecessors, and because of you. I thank you for that. I'm going to adjourn the meeting. And we also have another meeting coming right after, and that is, we're going to reconvene in 10 minutes because we have a CVTA Finance Committee meeting, okay? Thank you. Have a great weekend.
You can go home now. That's right, that's right. I don't know where you're going, so.